Bam. Go ahead.
This is Nolan Peterson, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
That's right. We are talking about Ukraine and Russia, the war, and all the things that go into that again, because, you know, the more I dig into this thing, and I know you'll get this, you've been living there for, 10 years, basically. And the more you dig in, the more you realize this isn't just a two-country fight. This is a very complex thing where there's competing interests, there's power, there's money dynamics, there's all of these very complex thing where there's competing interests, there's power, there's money dynamics. Let's back up and let's talk about the ramp up to this thing. And let's just start there. Let's start how does Ukraine prepare for this? We had an accord. We were going to not fight each other, and now we are fighting each other. Let's kind of cover that ramp up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I start from the very beginning. You know, my personal story in Ukraine began in 2014, right after the war began, when Russia first invaded. And at that time, I was really taken aback to witness this country that had just emerged from a pro-democratic revolution to overthrow a corrupt pro-Russian regime. And, you know, its military, Ukraine's military at the time, had been depleted by decades of post-Soviet corruption. And with Russia's unconventional invasion in the eastern Donbass region, and after Russia had just taken over Crimea, Ukraine's national defense largely depended on civilian volunteers, you know, men and women who had no military experience, who just grabbed weapons and went out to the Eastern Front and successfully reversed Russia's takeover of the eastern parts of the country. And let's be clear that a very pernicious propaganda line that eastern part of the country wanted to secede from Ukraine, join Russia, or just because they spoke the Russian language, and that's a lie. I mean, they were pro-Ukraine protests in Donetsk, which is the hub of Russia's war effort in the east, was for nearly a decade. And, you know, after interviewing and interacting with refugees from the eastern part of the country for a decade now, it's very clear that part of the country didn't want to leave Ukraine. And there's independent polling. Like in 1991, over 80% of that part of the country voted to secede from the Soviet Union. And even independent polling immediately before the Maidan Revolution in 2014 showed that the overwhelming majority of people in that part of the country were wanted to remain part of Ukraine and to not leave the fold.
Let me ask you a question right here, because this is important to note, because we have these sectors of the world, right? And it's usually a three-part thing. We want to stay, we want status quo, we want to go, right? And so you're saying that from what you're on the ground truth, and then what other organizations are polling, they're saying these folks want to be as part of Ukraine. This isn't like French Canadians who are sort of on the fence. You're saying this is a clear divide. We want to be Ukrainian.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there were some pro-Russian sentiments latent in some places, like Mariupol, for example, of a city that Russia annihilated in this war, and even other places like Kharkiv. But we should not confuse, you know, pro-Russian sentiment, an affinity for the culture, the language, you know, noting also this is after decades of imperial rule by Moscow during the Soviet Union as well. So families are divided between the borders and all these things. So if there was any affinity or sort of latent, you know, goodwill or relationship between the people in that part of the country with Russia, it did not indicate that they wanted to leave Ukraine or start a civil war to secede from the country. And I would argue without a doubt that now, you know, as we are well over nearing a year and a half into the full-scale invasion, it is those eastern regions of the country that have been most devastated by Russia's invasion. Cities like Mariupol looks like Stalingrad in World War II. It's just been wiped off the face of the earth. And the existence of Ukrainian citizens behind the front lines in the occupied areas is an abjectly barbaric experience. The Russian soldiers, you know, they murder civilians, they torture them. There's countless reports, verified reports from international organizations about how Russian soldiers are raping Ukrainian women, boys. It's just abducting children and sending them to Russia. It's a barbaric medieval occupation. And I think that if there was any sort of residual nostalgia for closer ties to Russia that existed in that part of Ukraine, it is gone now. Because now the population, the people who have fled and the people who, unfortunately remain behind for whatever reason, they now see the truth of what Russia is today. They see the madness of the Russian mindset, which Russia thinks it has to destroy what it wants to liberate. So I think that, to paint this conflict as it having its origins in some sort of civil war in Ukraine is completely untrue. The fact of the matter is, in 2014, the Ukrainian people decided to divorce themselves from Russia forever, to turn their backs on their Soviet past and to look forward to a pro-Western, pro-democratic future. And when Russia saw that, when Putin saw that, he understood that if the Russian people saw the Ukrainians succeed in this democratic experiment, that they would get that in their minds too, that, hey, why are we living in this, this authoritarian dictatorship when our, a fellow Slavic nation over here has done what we can't even dream of doing. And so Putin understood that revolutions have a tendency to act like dominoes, right? And remember, 2014 was not too long after the Arab Spring too, which spread like wildfire and caused many regimes to fall in the Middle East. So I think that clearly, from my understanding of Ukrainian and Russian culture, having lived in Ukraine for a decade and researching, been out there and seen this conflict firsthand for many years, I can say without a doubt that the origins of this conflict, they are in fact like Russia's attempt to reverse Ukraine's pro-democratic trajectory, to basically undercut Ukraine's success as a democratic state, and to send a clear message to the Russian people to not try this at home.
Do you think, look, you and I have been to a lot of conflict zone places, right? And I've been on the ground. And one of the things you notice is that urban, rural, and then super rural, and I'm talking like far removed from any kind of urban society, when you're living on your own, these sentiments aren't the same. I'm not saying that the super rural Ukrainians want to be Russians. They probably want to be left the fuck alone. But how does that differ? Because city people anywhere are not farm people, and farm people are not going to be city people wherever they go. But how have you had a chance to interact with the folks who live outside of, Kyiv and the other built up areas?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm married to a Ukrainian woman, and so visiting her grandparents, family members, and then also just having lived in the country since 2014 and doing reporting extensively across the entire country, just not being in Kyiv. But there, of course, Ukraine is, in one way, it's notable that life in Kyiv is very distinct from life in many small villages in Ukraine, where poverty, even before the full-scale invasion, was quite bad, and people lived very simple lives. I think among many older Ukrainians, there was a nostalgia perhaps for the Soviet era, not because of the political system, but just because they missed being young and they had an idealized image of their youth. But I think you note sort of this divide between the big city, the capital, and life in sort of the outskirts, the outlying parts of the country. Of course, there was a difference in mindset. However, the Ukrainian government implemented a very important change in the years after revolution. It's called decentralization. And what that effectively did is it devolved this like Soviet era centralized authority over governance as well as budgets that was all usually centered in Kyiv, and it started to give that away to local, smaller and smaller municipalities, towns, villages, whatever. And so the local mayors, the local city councils, they began to have the agency, the authority to spend money to improve their towns, to do things that they saw fit. Like if there's a pothole, let's get it fixed. Let's improve the school. Let's build a new sidewalk. And for example, my wife's hometown of Verkhny Plavny, a small city just south of Kremenchuk on the Dnipro River, after this decentralization measures went into effect, suddenly they were able to fix the roads. And Ukraine is notorious for horrible roads. They fixed the roads, they built new sidewalks, new playgrounds, they improved the schools, all these things that the local governments were suddenly able to do. And that rejuvenated the grassroots level of Ukraine's democracy. And I truly believe that any democracy is strong if it, based on what happens from the ground up, right? One of the strengths of America's democracy is that we have vibrant city council meetings, county commission meetings, and people, if you want something changed in your community, you can go complain to your local government officials to get it done. In Ukraine, that mindset just didn't exist. I mean, as an anecdote, back in 2014, I was in Mariupol with the Russians on the city gates. There's artillery going on outside. And this local group called Vmestia, which means together in Russian, they were meeting in a basement. And you had these young activists, maybe in their early 20s, teaching older citizens what it means to live in a democracy, teaching them that you're allowed to go complain about, repairs on the road or this or that, like that, to not be afraid, to not have the ostrich mentality, they called it during the Soviet Union, just bury your head, hoping for the best. So I would say that, yes, you identified that perhaps this divide between rural and urban living, but that was a dynamic that was changing for the better in Ukraine, because Ukraine was empowering those local governments to do what was best for their communities. And that agency, that idea in the Ukrainian citizens' mind that they had some power to affect the local environment, it allows them to buy into the concept of democracy. And I think that's one reason why Ukraine's pro-democratic evolution has been turbocharged compared with that of Russia, which has been stalled. Most Russian citizens, just go with the flow, who has ever in charge. And we saw that clearly in Rostov-on-Don when the Wagner group took over that city, and the local citizens just came out and said, "Woohoo! We support you, Wagner. You're in charge now, so we got your back." And then when they left, it's just the Russians. They don't feel that sort of agency in their own society the way Ukrainians do, and that's why I think Ukraine is on track to be a democratic success story. And I believe why Russia decided that it had to destroy Ukraine's future.
So one thing I do worry about, and I want to be hard on the American side, and look, we can take it, right? Because we've tried this quite a bit recently, and I don't buy into, look, the same crew that has screwed up the last couple of reconstruction projects are the same crew that's in charge of this one. So they deserve the critique. I don't know that we deserve any kind of trust. We tend to overplay our hand. We are overly optimistic. We are overly pushy with our way. We expect people to hit a certain bar that isn't possible. We forget our own past. We're really bad at this, man. And we tend to point the finger and say there's corruption, and yet we are the corrupter, right? Like, so we'll come in, and if a fool and his money are often parted, right? We go to a place with our money and we act foolishly, and we don't hold ourselves accountable. One of the things I always say is, this briefs well, and that's why we'll do it. And then I'll go back, because I have access to the ground in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'll go, hey, where did that $500,000 go? Or where did that $10 million go? And it's gone. And then I'll send that report up, and they're like, never mind that. And so you have this clear and obvious case of just nonsensory, where we've just thrown this money into the wind, and I'm told that it's fine. It's not fine, right? Because that leads to bad things. And in a place as rich in resources as Ukraine, and there's clearly people vying for power. We're having the conversation here on the show about state control of various enterprises. I'm going to be a little fair to the oligarchs right now. We point a finger at somebody who's done well in business, we say that's an oligarch, and yet we don't know what an oligarch is. Especially these people that have come from the Soviet time. They've been good at business. We don't know good or bad. We've got different papers saying different people are different oligarchs. We've got different think tanks funded by different people. Everybody's got their baby. It's super precious. Hey, don't those guys are okay. Those guys are okay. So all of this stuff, all of this intrigue, which is slathered by intrigue, which is hidden by intrigue, and you know what I'm talking about. Like, it's very hard to suss out who the good people are and who the bad people are. And so I don't trust us to
I can help you with that.
Please.
The good people are Ukrainians and the bad people are the Russians.
Okay, fair enough. All right, fair enough.
You know what? I don't say that flippantly, because it's, of course, easy to make black and white distinct. Oh, Russia, whatever.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'll reverse a little bit here. When Russia was massing its forces on Ukraine's borders in late 2021, early 2022.
Right.
Many people were highly skeptical that Russia was actually going to invade for many reasons. And one of the most prevalent reasons was that some experts said, well, look at Russian media. They're just not ramping up the propaganda to kind of glamour the people into believing that a war is necessary, right? You're not seeing this spike in propaganda to rile up the nation for war.
Right.
But when the war began, the Russian people immediately bought into it.
Right.
And they hardly bat an eye.
Yeah.
When reports come out of mass slaughters of Ukrainian citizens in Bucha and Irpin, when Russian cruise missiles slam into Ukrainian apartment blocks, right? When Mariupol is razed from the face of the earth. I mean, there's probably, because journalists haven't been able to get into Mariupol since the Russian invasion, we don't know how many civilians were killed, but I have been in contact with officials from Mariupol, some of the local government officials, and they say tens of thousands of civilians were probably killed in that attack, that siege. Yeah. And the thing is, from what we see through online interactions and through my family and friends who have connections in Russia, you can see through social media and through Russian television news shows and whatnot, like the people either they support the war or they just apathetic about what their country is doing. They just don't care. They'd rather just live their lives. And so the Russian people are definitely complicit in this conflict. And I think that, it's on, I don't know, as somebody who served in Iraq and Afghanistan in wars that lost their ways and were sometimes morally ambiguous about what we were doing there. As an American, I look at the war in Ukraine, and I feel like it's a privilege to support Ukraine's cause, because in our lifetime, and probably for generations, there's never been a more clear-cut case of good versus evil, of people fighting for a just cause, to just defend their homeland, to protect their families, to stop the slaughter.
But let's clarify this then. Let's agree on that. Let's agree that Russia did this thing. And if it was unstoppable and no one else could stop them, then let's point our finger for right now directly at Russia, and we'll let history decide if it was unstoppable or not. And let's for right now say, Russia is the big dick in the room, and we'll be angry at them and we'll beat the shit out of them, and we're glad to help. Let's agree on that part. And let's also point a finger at Donald Trump, who the other day said, I would want the war to stop because people are dying, they're being raped, there's atrocities going on. And let's not lose sight of that. This is the point, right? There's horrors going on right now, and good side, bad side. Let's try to get this atrocity to end as soon as possible, because it's horrible. And let's not get too wrapped up in embracing Sherman and making it as horrible as we can, as fast as we can. So, let's just get it over with as soon as we can, because it is horrible. And it's not going to be gentle for a long time. It's going to be horrible for decades. All of these women that are going to be abused there's plenty of atrocity to go around. It is horrible. You're right. And it's at the Russians' feet, right? Until we know otherwise, it's at the Russians' feet.
Yeah, for the people who oppose arming Ukraine, I think there's just two completely false interpretations of reality behind that argument. And people often cloak their desire to stop funding Ukraine with this idea that we're doing the humane thing by just forcing the war to end, by forcing the parties to negotiate, whatever. Right. It's like, okay, if you stop arming Ukraine, why would Russia stop fighting? Why would they negotiate? Russia's goal isn't to hold the front lines in the Donbass. Remember, the war started with Russia trying to invade Kyiv and kill Zelensky.
Encircled it. Yeah, right.
Russia's goal has been to subjugate the entire country, to conquer Ukraine, to eliminate its culture, its language, its people. In the occupied areas, there's been verified reports of prisoners taken by Russia, men who are castrated, women who have had their vaginas sealed with sealants because they don't want them to breed. This is like a genocide. Full stop. Yeah. And if we just stop arming Ukrainians, people act like this war is only going on because Ukrainians won't stop fighting. Yeah. The fact is, Ukrainians, they've got their finger in the dam right now, and they pull it out, and the whole thing's going to blow. If we stop arming Ukraine, Russia will advance. It will recommence its assault to destroy the country. And if there's one lesson we can learn from history, is that an apocalyptic war of conquest in Europe does not stay quarantined to Europe. 2 world wars have started this way, and I guarantee a third one will too if we don't stop it now. And the other thing I should make very clear is that if Ukrainians suddenly don't have HIMARS or tanks or whatever, they're not going to stop fighting.
Yeah.
Even if Russia was able to conquer half the country, Ukrainians will wage an insurgency for 100 years if they have to get back their land, to boot the Russians out. So if you want to avoid a forever war, if you want to avoid needless suffering and everything, there's only one course of action to take, and that's give Ukraine everything it needs now to win the war as decisively and quickly as possible, to force Russia to capitulate, and then immediately bring Ukraine, in my opinion, into NATO's fold, because Russia has demonstrated time and time again that its so-called red lines don't exist. And then Putin is willing to back down when he's got back against the corner. So I just, there's this notion that somehow if Ukraine doesn't have these weapons, or they stop getting support from the US, that Russia's going to be like, okay, well, let's sign a peace deal. No, Russia's goal began in 2014, and it remains today, the destruction of the Ukrainian country, sovereign nation.
Yeah.
And so
I want to push back on you on this a little bit, and in a way that's positive, right? Because it's not as simple as this, right? Russia has people that it can break this war out. It can lean on Iran. It can lean on the Middle East. It can give U.S. problems in other places. It really can. The U.S. has interest in other places. It can cause problems in a number of areas. By the way, when the war is over, Ukraine is still attached to Russia economically, and the region is attached to Russia economically. They can do a long-term war, and they can continue to cause problems, right? So it's not as easy as just putting him in NATO and everything else, because that can inflate and elongate the war, right? We don't know how to do this well, gracefully. So I agree. We need Ukraine to win. And we need to punish Russia, but we can't put Russia so beaten up that we've seen this in history too, that they come back worse and more evil than before, right? We have to figure out how to get them worse.
You have a government sanctioning genocide.
We're
there, man. We're at the bottom right now. We are at the doomsday scenario.
Yeah.
The world's largest, the country with the largest nuclear arsenal has gone mad.
Yeah,
we're there, and you can't.
I can paint you a scenario that's worse.
I just don't see there's this idea we've tried over and over and over again to think that we can freeze this conflict, or we can appease Russia, or bring them back in the fold. It doesn't work. At some point, we have to understand what we're dealing with.
Yeah,
right. The madness, the insanity you see in the Russian mindset, their belief in a fantastic version of the world that just doesn't exist.
Yeah. So and how do you accomplish that then? How do you get Russia to? Do you say you have them? You force them to quit with no conditions, that they have to sign something on the deck of the Missouri? Is that what you envision? And I'm asking because I don't know what you expect.
At some point, their war effort. The objective of the war in Ukraine is for the Russian war effort to collapse.
Right.
Ukrainians want to get back their territory, but more importantly, they want to liberate their citizens who are living under Russian occupation in those conditions that we talked about earlier that are so brutal and horrible. But Ukrainians have been living under the threat of Russian aggression and oppression for over a century, for generations.
Yeah.
And this as their historic moment to finally stop this cycle of madness. In the Holodomor in the 1930s, maybe 6 or 7 million Ukrainians were killed during Stalin's forced famine.
Horrible, right? Yeah.
During World War II, the purges, you had just the Red Army sweeping through and destroying everything reconquered, so to speak.
Right.
And the Ukrainians see this as their historic opportunity to finally establish their sovereignty, their freedom from Russian oppression once and for all.
Right.
They're not looking for half measures. They don't want one of the most common things I hear from my friends in the Ukrainian military is, I don't want my son or my daughter or my grandchildren to have to be at war with Russia again. And we have to stop this now, and they see this as their chance to defeat Russia on the battlefields in Ukraine. So they're not going to go into Moscow and try and capitulate or destroy. No, they want Russia out of their territory,
right,
in a decisive manner,
right,
that puts the threat at bay, and then Ukraine will solidify its relationships with the West. You don't see Russia trying to reconquer the Baltics or whatever, because they know they don't want to go to war with NATO. And so that's Ukraine's best bet to secure its future, to secure its freedom and its democracy and its existence down the line. And I think that we now have incontrovertible evidence that Russia is an imperialistic state bent on destruction and genocide. And it's not going to get any better if we give them an inch. We have to stop them. We have to prove that they have to show them they've been defeated in Ukraine. And hopefully down the road that precipitates an evolution in Russia's government that might prevent this from happening again in the future.
I just don't have faith in that, man. I don't have faith that Ukraine will stop at the border of Russia and say, that's it, we're done kicking your ass. And now we're going to set up NATO checkpoints here in the border.
What evidence do you have that Ukraine wants to invade Russian territory?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that Ukraine will. I'm not saying that they will. I'm just saying that I don't believe that they will. The energy will stop there, and that Russia will allow NATO to be on its border, because they've said that's a red line for them, right? And so that won't.
Russia won't allow NATO to be on their border. What right does Russia have to determine the political affiliations of countries?
What right did they have to invade last time? I'm just saying that these things aren't that simple. It's never that cut and dry.
I think it's pretty simple. Each country has a sovereign right to determine.
That's exactly right. They have a sovereign right, and we've made agreements with them
of its own citizens.
Yeah, but Russia has that right too.
Russia has no right to access to resources. Ukraine citizens.
Okay, well, look, I don't want to argue back and forth with you on that, but these things are delicate, right? This is statecraft now, not warcraft, and they have access to resources that all of Europe needs, and so there has to be some give and take. And I don't know how they do that. I don't know how they make it so that there isn't a soft power war or a low intensity conflict war. To do that, there's so much money at stake too, right? This isn't just tanks and materiel. This is a lot of other stuff. There's a lot of things that they're vying for, right? And look, shame on the Russians for causing all this trouble and putting us on the brink of that. And I'll say this: there is a scenario. Who knows if this happens? But if Russia is weakened to the point where Chechnya winds up with a nuclear weapon, that's a possibility. It may not happen. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but they have so many. If they are weakened to the point where they can't control their arsenal, someone gets a team together. It's a real thing. That really could happen. Hopefully not, but we have to be careful about how far we push Russia back into a corner, because horrible things can happen,
Horrible things are happening. And that's why I fundamentally diverge with this line of thinking about Ukraine's so-called catastrophic victory. We have a genocide going on. We have the indiscriminate bombing of Ukraine.
I agree with you that a genocide is going on. Yeah, I agree with you on that.
In Kyiv, down my street, Iranian kamikaze drones were hitting and killing people. Russian cruise missiles were killing in a European capital. And to worry about a litany of hypotheticals at this point, when we have the worst case scenario already happening.
Yeah.
I don't understand what. So. Where is the give and take with the war in Ukraine with Russia? You can genocide a little bit in this part of the country. You can enslave.
I don't think you should genocide anywhere. I just don't know how you turn it off.
No, I just don't it. Just when I hear about negotiating and all these things, how.
But there will be negotiations. There will be business after this. People will interact with business. This is reality. This whole region is
war will end, life will go on, and God forbid Ukraine has to make, some sort of concession and freeze the conflict along front lines, or this war devolves into another stalemate like it did in the East for years, perhaps generations.
Right.
But I can tell you, Russia's goal remains the same.
Yeah.
Which is to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign, independent nation.
Right.
And so the war was to stop. If Ukraine's counteroffensive stalls
Yeah.
out the momentum, and there's just no more combat potential, and the decision is made at some point to freeze this conflict. I mean, you're a fool if you think that that is a good outcome, because Russia will attack again. Russia will
I think that's always the case.
And
I
try
think Russia
this
will
again,
always crave that land, right? They will always crave
unless they're
Ukraine.
defeated.
But what does that mean? Is that there's no Russia?
It means that it means the Russian troops leave Ukrainian sovereign territory.
Okay.
How is that like a confusing, controversial stuff? Like,
I just think that they will. Okay, they go back, and then everybody has to do business again, and then Russia will rebuild their forces, and they'll want the same thing. And if we back them into a corner, they'll still crave Ukraine.
Russia's not going to invade Ukraine when Ukraine is part of NATO.
Okay, yeah, I guess we disagree on that. I think they'll always.
Russia will invade Ukraine if Ukraine's a member
I think that the potential for them to do that is very high. Yeah, I think it is, because we will have backed them into a corner and given them no choice except for do things that are even more nefarious.
How is Russia backed into a corner?
Because they've already said.
What threat does NATO pose to Russia? When was the last time NATO attacked Russia? When was the last time Ukraine? Like, when did Ukraine ever, like, on its own accord, attack Russia? It never happened. I mean, during the full-scale war,
you're right. It's all going to work out great.
Because
it's all going to work out great. It's all going to work out great. Every time we encroach upon Russia's sovereignty as a NATO force, it never makes Russia mad. It never backs them into a corner. None of this is at all inspired by NATO's further encroachment. The West has no. Didn't Putin just the other day reference the encroachment of the West on the East's area? Didn't he just reference that?
His area.
Yeah, the East.
Okay, just think about what you're saying, though.
I'm saying what he said. Didn't he just say that?
Okay, you may parrot this idea of
I'm saying all this stuff in a good spirit. Like we're having
on Russia's sovereignty, right? Okay.
Yes.
NATO is not expanding. NATO is not encroaching. What happened was that the Soviet Union, Moscow's former vassal states, have all vehemently rejected any association with Russia moving forward. Moreover, they all see Russia as a threat, right? These countries appealed to NATO for help to join as protection against Russia. Yes. This is not some global conspiracy to hold Russia down or whatever. These are countries that of their own accord, of their own volition, have decided that it's in the best interest of their future and their people's prosperity to link up with the West in a common defense against an aggressive foe that has persecuted their citizens for generations. To have the Baltics join NATO or Ukraine, how does that infringe on Russia's sovereignty?
And the Balkans.
But explain to me, how does that encroach on the ability of...
It's not up to me to decide. It's not up to me to decide. I'm telling you, he's the guy that decides. You know, he's the guy that decides. I'll tell you a different... Let me give you the story from a different angle. I wrote a paper that's in the NATO birthday manual that Troy University put together, right? And we were there, and there were some Estonian dudes there and some other folks there. And someone from the American crowd stood up and said, well, this is several years ago. And they said, will Russia ever join NATO? And all of the Latvian dudes in the crowd stood up and bristled. They're like, what are you talking about, right? Because you're right. Like, they don't want to hear that. Like, that's horrible. And that's the whole reason why NATO exists to them. But there are people that are like, no, like it's a European thing. I get what you're saying, and I don't disagree with you. I am not saying that Russia is justified in that belief from our point of view. From their point of view, he does get to say, you said you wouldn't do this, and then you went and did it. And then you look at the map of like Iran and like all of our positions around it. You look at map of Russia, and the circle is getting tighter, and they don't like that. They get to not like that. They get to say, if you keep doing this, we're going to continue to be pissed at you. So yes, they get to be upset about that. I don't justify their behavior.
Countries choosing their own path forward.
Yes, they get to be upset about, especially when the U.S. makes these agreements with them.
Russia doesn't get to dictate what happens in the Baltics or Ukraine.
But the U.S. makes agreements saying, hey, we're not going to do this. The U.S. leads NATO. They're saying, hey, we're not going to do this thing. And then NATO does the opposite.
Well, first of all,
that creates a problem.
Agreement is pretty nebulous, and I think it was more of like a...
Look, it doesn't matter if it's nebulous. If the sides agree, And
Show
then
me the
they
ratified treaty that NATO.
I don't have to show you anything. I'm just showing you what Putin is saying. You guys have done this. You've been in my land. You've been on my side. You guys continue to do this.
My
So
land.
this goes back. Yes,
Okay.
his land.
It's not his land. The Baltics aren't his land. Ukraine's not his land.
Look,
Those are sovereign. Okay. I mean, the bottom line here is that we're not threatening Russia's sovereignty. We are threatening Russia's imperialistic designs on countries it has no right to rule over. Russia isn't feeling threatened by the West. Russia isn't thinking it's facing some existential crisis or threat from the West.
Yeah.
Okay. What Russia realizes is its dreams of reconquering its Soviet vassals is dying. It's going away because those countries don't want it. And it's blaming the West. It's blaming neo-Nazis. It's blaming biolabs. It's blaming, LGBTQ communities. It's blaming everything you can possibly find to explain why these countries that it had enslaved for generations suddenly, don't want to be a part of Russia's empire anymore.
Yeah.
And so this is not a encroachment or a constriction around Russia. It's Russia trying to reach out and take places that don't belong to it and to inflict its interest. And now, one of the most dumb arguments I hear is like, well, what would you think if Russia put, troops in Mexico or Canada? Well, you know what? You don't see Mexico and Canada asking for Russian troops. Because America isn't going in there and murdering, bombing their cities and sending spies with polonium and stuff in their border. Russia is a threat to its neighbors, and its neighbors are reacting in a way that any logical, organism would, which is to defend itself.
Right.
So Russia,
I think we largely agree on this, right? Like I am talking about things from Putin's point of view, and he does have a point because the 431 infantry was in his territory 100 years ago. He is talking about factual things. But
there's no point. I diverge from you right there.
No, he does have a point. He runs a country. He gets to say these things. He does. He does have a point. And he is going to be sitting at the table when they negotiate this, right? Or someone who's going to be sitting in his chair because he's gone. And we are going to have to deal with the fact that there is a Russia sitting there. And we're going to have to figure out how to get along with this country. They have done horrible things. We're going to have to look at them and say, now what do we do, right? We're going to have to do that at some point. And they're going to be a player
there. And the fact that, if Putin is deposed or whatever, there's no guarantee that the next leader
is that's terrifying
too. This same madness that he believes in. In fact,
hopefully we get a better
scenario. The more we understand sort of the prevalent Russian mindset and appreciation or their outlook on this war, we understand that many Russians are at best apathetic about what's going on. So I worry that there's this hope or aspiration among many in the West that once Putin is gone, that somehow Russia is going to transform and become this pro-Western country. And I don't see that happening. I think but I do not think that handing Russia a victory of any sort in Ukraine is going to make this situation any better. And I guess I fundamentally diverge from you on that. And I see that, Russia is a country that, the Russian society is a thug mobster society where power rules the day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're not wrong about that. I mean, they like a strong man, right? They like their.
Right, but when the strong man stumbles, he may lose his sway over the country.
Yeah.
So I think that if Ukraine, it's a tough proposition. I think that Ukraine's best chance for success at this point is that there will be, and we see signs of this within the Russian military, although not not necessarily like widespread, that there could be some sort of collapse of morale, chain of command. The recent affair with the Russian general Ivan Popov, saying that Russian troops are being slaughtered and all these things.
Yeah,
there's in the Wagner mutiny, I believe, it's not just because of Prigozhin's ambitions. It also reflects the atrocious circumstances which many Russian soldiers face in the front lines.
Yeah,
they're basically being fed to the front lines as meat, as fodder.
It's not easy to be a Russian troop, right? They don't get fed well.
A breakdown within that command and control structure, the morale. And that's something that perhaps Ukraine could exploit to make massive gains. But I think the way the war is now, it's a very hard slog, and Ukraine's going to continue to fight meter by meter for its territory. And Ukraine has every right to do so because it's fighting for its existence.
Yeah, no, we agree on that, and Ukraine is going to continue to fight, and Europe and the U.S. are going to continue to support that, and I think that's the appropriate thing to do once we get through this thing. And look, we're going to get to some crazy weather, and so that's gonna change the dynamic of the fight, and then we're going to get to spring, and that's going to change the fight because it's hard to fight out in the spring, and we're going to see things go on. So if this thing doesn't end in the next 100 or so days, it's not likely to end until next summer, maybe, and then cut to it being over in the winter. Who knows? It's crazy. Do you have any sense at all on when you think we might get to the table and close this thing out?
Yeah, well, it's wars are dependent on so many factors, many of which
Yeah.
you can't even imagine at the
Right.
time to make
Yeah.
a prediction.
Yeah.
In those first few horrible days, I was in Kyiv, obviously, when the war began, and
Yeah.
at that point, I none of us knew what was going to happen.
Right.
I
Right.
will say it was quite striking, quite amazing to talk to my Ukrainian friends, who many of whom had no military experience and just went out and went to the front lines around Kyiv, that they all expected to win even in those first few days, and their expectation of victory has not dimmed.
Yeah.
Moreover, the Ukrainian civilian population, you look at polling about the attitude of them toward making any concessions toward Russia for the sake of peace, and that the share of Ukrainians who say no concessions under any
Right.
circumstance, we win this thing 100%. I mean, it's above 80%, near
Right.
90%, and it's going up the
Yeah.
longer the war goes on. So Ukrainians' grit, their resilience, their commitment to the fight
Yeah.
has remained sort of unbroken throughout the conflict.
Nice.
I don't see national morale cracking. However, life, to be honest, life is very hard in Ukraine right now. Like, the economy is just, completely,
Yeah.
basically, the rug has been swept out from under the feet of the economy. Things are very
Yeah.
tough for people. You interact with any Ukrainian, and I would say almost without a doubt, they know somebody who's been killed, whether a friend
of course.
or member in this war. Personally, at least half of my friends who are in the Ukrainian military are dead.
Mhm.
As a sort of a anecdotal sample right there. I mean, many of these men served in 2014-15, then went and restarted their service once the full-scale invasion began. So a lot of them are out there in the hot spots. So it may not be the most accurate sample size, but the war has definitely taken a toll for sure.
Yeah.
Ukrainian society, and it's extraordinarily tough. But it's also, just absolutely, it's awe-inspiring to see.
How's your access to more? Look, I'm going to say comfort items. To us, it'll sound like bananas, citrus, natural gas, electricity. How's the access to that stuff in Kyiv?
Yeah, it's unbroken. I mean, even I think
that's a good sign.
Yeah, I mean, during the first month when the Russian forces were trying to take the city, you did see less gasoline available. You saw store shelves thin out somewhat, but there was never empty store shelves or anything. The southern route into Kyiv always remained open. There was a flow of supplies that kept the city fed, although also about half the city's population left during the initial part of the war, so there's fewer people to take care of.
Right.
But across Ukraine, I mean, I think generally, supplies remain steady, although prices have gone up. There's a lot of inflation on things because everything has to be trucked in or taken by train. There's no air traffic whatsoever, obviously, since the war began. So logistics are tough, and prices have certainly gone up. But I think as far as the base products, I mean, you could still get non-essential things for sure. You can go Coca-Cola, Diet Coke, protein bar. I mean, those things are still fighting their way in Ukraine. So I think that, the country is relatively well supplied. During the winter, I mean, we all followed the news, and I was there throughout the winter in Kyiv and experienced the Russian attacks on critical infrastructure sites. So we frequently losing power, heating, water supplies.
Right.
That was tough in the dead of winter, but Ukrainians.
How far east do you think it remains as stable as it is in Kyiv? Like how far? Because, Ukraine's a big country, about the size of Texas, so 250,000 square miles. But how far to the east can you go before you start to lose things?
Well, I'd say, once you get within, it depends on the range of the weapons being used in the front lines. But once you get to a relatively close area to the front lines, there's sort of you're within the shadow, so to speak, of the artillery and the missile attacks and stuff like that. At that point, you can usually hear the thunder from the front lines, and it becomes a different scenario. But, obviously, one defining factor of the war in Ukraine versus today versus what existed between 2014 and February 24th, 2022 is that, there is no limit to the front lines like there was. I mean, the first 8 years of the war, the front lines were very much a quarantined area from the rest of the country. Life throughout the rest of the country went on as normal. But now in Ukraine, with the missile attacks, you see civilians being killed in all corners of the country. There is really no safe space in the country, and I think that's hard. Even as an American like myself, a veteran who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, even when we were abroad in those wars, you go back to your base, you can grab a Subway sandwich, you can stuff, indirect fire attacks and whatnot. You felt like a sense of safety when you were back within your walls.
Yeah.
But in Ukraine, even in a metropolis like Kyiv, at night when you're hearing the anti-aircraft systems thundering and you see plummeting fire trails of Shahed drones or cruise missiles hitting the earth, it's scary. And I think that constant shadow of danger and death is, it's an experience that probably would have broken other nations, other peoples. But I think scholars will be investigating the Ukrainian society for generations to try and understand what glue exists within that country's society and culture that allowed them to hold it together during these incredibly trying circumstances. I mean, maybe the closest analogy would be London during the Blitz, World War II, or something like that.
They're definitely nations that stand up these things. You're an air guy, right? I'm a ground guy. And so when you're on the ground, it must be especially hard for you because you'd probably rather be up in the air with the stick between your legs, because that's how you fight, right? And so how has that been, that transition for you to be in not your safe space? I mean, how is that for you?
Well, I think, I've also, I was a pilot in the Air Force, but I also, as a journalist, have embedded with U.S. forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So I got a little taste of what, things like on the ground, and also lots of time in Ukraine on the ground, and even with the Kurds in the battle from Mosul in 2016. So I think even more distinctly, between, the experience of being in the air versus on the ground obviously is a very big difference. But I think the most distinct difference is the fact that, in Ukraine, even beginning back in 2014, there's a sense that you're kind of you're on the weak side of the fight. Rather than in the United States military, you always feel like you've got air dominance. You're going to have, if somebody gets hurt, you have a medevac available within minutes, hopefully. And so there's this safety net, so to speak, or this support apparatus around you as a member of the U.S. military, at least in the wars we've gotten used to since 2001, that provided a sense of superiority at all times. Out with the Ukrainians, you feel like there's always a threat, particularly now with the prolific use of small and medium-sized drones in combat, which provide overwatch for Russian artillery. They drop hand grenades. We've all seen those snuff videos on Twitter. So there is this constant sense of danger out there that is inescapable. And I think that is the most striking. I mean, the electronic warfare part of it too, I should add. Like you use your radio, you might be inviting enemy fire. You cluster with electronics, you might be inviting, enemy fire. So there's just a whole litany of things that you always have to be cognizant of your electromagnetic emissions. So you have to conceal your electromagnetic presence the same way you do your visual presence. And you have to always be cognizant of the fact that the enemy could be targeting you. And that becomes a strain on soldiers in a way that I think most American service men and women are unfamiliar with, because even when we were abroad deployed, except for perhaps the most extreme outposts or in Afghanistan or something like that, where you're constantly under danger. But for the most part, we didn't have 24/7 life-threatening danger when we were at war. And I think that's something the Ukrainians exist under. And that's a psychological strain that I don't think many living in America, especially now that most of our generation of combat veterans in Iraq and Afghanistan are matriculated out of the military and gone on to other things. The younger generation in the U.S. military, many of whom have not experienced combat, that's going to be a hard reality to adjust to in the next war, where we're not going to be fighting goat herders in the Hindu Kush or some terrorist, group in Iraq. We're going to be fighting in countries with electronic warfare capabilities, swarms of drones, missiles, aircraft, spy satellites. So that sense of constant danger, I think, was the difference between my military service and what I've experienced in Ukraine.
Yeah. And as a guy who's been on the ground in those remote spots, you're exposed. And if you leave the camp and you go 45 minutes off, there's no help coming. Not in time for you. There could be a QRF, won't get there in time. They're not Q enough. And there's not enough stuff overhead because it's not Q enough. Like, you were there in that fight until that fight is over. And there's something coming, but it's just not Q enough. And you're right. You live with that. And you hope that the E4 who's up late at night is watching that heat scope and making sure that, and you're always under that pressure. And when you walk through, and you probably went to the green zone, and you walk through the green zone and you hear that incoming, where every step you're like, where's the closest shelter? Where's the closest shelter? Every step, right? And you live with that, and it eats away at you. It burns your candle. And you're right. And it's a shitty way to live if you're not a warrior and you live in a city. And it's a drone. The drone is silent. There is no thing saying incoming. That's a heavy load.
And that's the point to make, is that, that experience of living under indirect fire in Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, for the overwhelming majority of Americans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, that was their combat experience. That was their life-threatening situation.
Right.
But that is the daily reality now.
Yeah.
Going on, now we're like nearing a year and a half into war for millions of Ukrainian citizens. Are living under that kind of. And I will say too, a Russian cruise missile makes a bigger boom than the things we were used to in Iraq.
Yeah, they do.
Especially when you have like an S-300 converted coming in supersonic speed. Yeah. And it is, a type of war that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. Thought it was something relegated to history books and movies about World War II. But this conflict has certainly underscored the fact that, history does not automatically bend in the right direction.
It does not.
We have to forcibly bend it toward justice and peace by the will of brave people like Ukrainians who are willing to fight for freedom. And we owe them gratitude for what they've done to defend us. Because
amen to that, man. The Ukrainians, you have a people that are willing to fight, and we need to continue to get behind them. We totally agree on that, and hopefully we make good decisions in how we back them. Again, I don't trust us to do that because we've been bad at our choices. That's just our record reflecting back at us, but. The Ukrainians are a good partner, and I appreciate that. I want to just. Since we have a couple minutes left here, I wanted to ask you this. We look forward, we see some elections on the U.S. horizon. Do you have any thoughts at all? Like, what would Ukraine, who would they want? Like, do they have any notion at all? Like, hey, you know what? We want that Robert Kennedy guy, or give us Tim Scott, or, whatever. Like, do they have any notion or any care at all?
Oh, I think most Ukrainians are pretty consumed right now with their daily.
Right. Because it matters, right? Like,
obviously Ukrainians want a U.S. president. They would wish that a U.S. president would understand the necessity and the utility of continuing to support their fight for freedom, independence. So I think that most likely, in the eyes of many Ukrainians, they hope that the next president, or the next Congress, or whatever, is going to continue to understand what's at stake in their country. Because, like I don't say this as like a jingoistic catchphrase, but Ukrainians, the ones on the front lines, something you hear. I've heard since 2014, but I hear it even more prevalently now. Is there's a sense that they're also fighting for the world. They're fighting to stop this generational, destructive force that is emanated out of Russia, and they see themselves as defending not only their own existence and survival, but holding this threat at bay for the sake of other peoples around the world, particularly in Europe and the West. So, I guess maybe there's just this hope that we in the West will prove to be sort of deserving of the sacrifices that Ukrainians are making, not only for themselves, but to maintain the world that we live in. And I think we in America are very ignorant oftentimes of how much our success, our prosperity, our peace, our ability to live the lives we do depends on the world that we created after World War II. I mean, the fact that, there are no pirates destroying shipping around the world, except for little pockets off of Somalia, maybe. The fact it's the U.S. Navy, man, right? The fact, just there are so many things that have happened since, the way the world we live in is created the prosperity that we enjoy. And to think that we can retrench and have that ostrich mentality and think that everything is just going to keep going on as it has. I mean, the last, the interval between World War II and now has been probably the most aberrant experience in human history in terms of the prosperity that's built in the world. And
I can tell you here, pretty much everybody is on board with it. We get a little sick of hearing the hundreds of billions of dollars going out the door, right? And that's going to matter in the election for sure. But I think everybody's on board with it. Don't get the impression that most of us are against what Ukraine is doing. A lot of us are worried about corruption, and we don't want to see a bunch of money go out. A lot of us, and I in particular, because I've got ground experience, I expect there to be a whole lot of fuckery and money going out the door and being wasted during reconstruction, and I think that's fair. But in terms of the fight, I think we're behind the Ukrainians, and we should all expect that we're going to see that through. Then again, we asked the Kurds about our willingness to stick to it, right? So there is a history with us turning coat and running away. And look, this is their war of independence. Truly believe that, right? This is Pete speaking personally. This is their chance to really, hopefully, finally shake the Russians off their back, and maybe they have to come back and fight this again. But we had our help from the French and the Dutch and other countries to get the British off our back, and it took us a couple of fights. And hopefully this is it, and they'll be able to do it. But I want to give you the final word. And listen, dude, I appreciate you. And I know we had to work through the front end of things, but I think by and large we agree that this fight has to be won by the Ukrainians, and it's. Who knows what's going to happen. So I appreciate you working on that with me. And I hope you come back and we talk some more about this, because you're on the ground, and I appreciate that. You got the ground truth, and I need more of it. Anything you want to say in closing?
Well, I think, you mentioned there at the end that Ukraine is fighting for its independence, and that's certainly true. And it's been the case since 2014. But I think, an important distinction since the full-scale invasion began is that Ukrainians now understand that they're fighting not just for their independence, but their survival. And that this is an unprovoked act of aggression by Russia. Nothing that the West has done or that Ukraine has done internally justifies or excuses anything that Russia has done. This is an act of madness on Russia's part. It's a crime. It's a crime against Ukrainians. It's a crime against humanity. And there is no explanation for this other than Russia has completely lost its moral way and is engaged on a nihilistic war of imperial conquest and genocide that the world has got to stop. And so I as somebody who's been abroad for a long time and now, witnessing some of the discourse and dialogue that is bubbling up from some sectors of American society, questioning the utility of supporting Ukraine, questioning whether Ukraine is a democracy, whether they have religious freedom, whether they have elections. I mean, these things are insane. It's just, to me, as somebody who's been there and seen Ukraine's remarkable transformation into a vibrant democratic society in the last 8 years, to somehow excuse Russia's barbarism by trying to find these obscure examples of, imperfect behavior within Ukrainian society, to me is mind-boggling. It'd be like blaming the Jews for the Holocaust because they didn't have elections or something like that in Poland. It's just absurd. It's mind-boggling. I'm embarrassed that people in my country believe these things. And I hope that, people like me who have seen the ground truth, who actually have been to Ukraine, have seen the war, can continue to fight back against this misinformation, because, mistruths like that will not simply end when the war in Ukraine begins. When it ends, it's permeating our mindsets, and I fear, as we allow this toxicity to permeate the discourse, what effect that'll have on America's moral standing moving forward.
All right, thanks, man. Hang in there 1 second. I'm going to say goodbye to you proper like. Let me roll these credits. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.